The crimson sun barely pierced the morning mist over Boston Harbor on June 17th, 1775, when Colonel William Prescott felt the tremor of approaching doom beneath his boots. From his position atop Breed's Hill, he watched as the British ships in the harbor began their ominous dance of preparation, their masts swaying like skeletal fingers against the dawn sky. Colonial forces had made their move in the darkness, and now the Empire would respond with the full weight of its military might. Prescott's weathered hands gripped his musket as he surveyed the hastily constructed earthworks his men had thrown up during the night. The provincial soldiers, many of them farmers and shopkeepers, just weeks removed from their plows and counters, had worked with desperate efficiency to create fortifications that would soon face the most professional army in the world. The irony was not lost on him that they stood not on Bunker Hill as originally planned, but on the lower Breed's Hill, a tactical error that would soon prove both costly and historically significant. The British had awakened to find the rebels had fortified the heights overlooking Boston, a direct challenge to their occupation of the city. General Thomas Gage, the military governor of Massachusetts, stood in his headquarters studying the reports with growing alarm. The colonial force had appeared overnight like a specter, transforming the strategic landscape in a single evening. This was no longer the scattered resistance of angry farmers throwing rocks at tax collectors. This was organized military defiance that demanded a swift and decisive response. Major General William Howe, recently arrived from England with reinforcements, counseled immediate action. The British could not allow the rebels to maintain their position on the heights. It would render Boston Harbor vulnerable to colonial artillery. Yet as Howe examined the terrain through his spyglass, he felt the first stirrings of unease. The slope up to the colonial position was steep and exposed, offering little cover for an advancing force. The rebels had chosen their ground well, perhaps better than they realized. As the morning progressed, both sides engaged in a deadly ballet of preparation. The British began loading their ships with the implements of war, cannon, ammunition, and the scarlet-clad soldiers who would soon face their first real test against American resolve. Across the water, the colonial forces worked frantically to strengthen their defenses, knowing that time was their enemy. Every shovelful of earth, every sharpened stake, every carefully positioned stone might mean the difference between victory and catastrophe. The citizens of Boston, caught between the two armies, watched from their windows and rooftops as history prepared to unfold. Many had family on both sides of the conflict, sons and fathers who had chosen different paths in this emerging civil war. The tension was palpable, an electric charge that seemed to make the very air vibrate with anticipation. Children were hurried inside, shutters were closed, and prayers were whispered in a dozen languages as the city held its breath. By midday, the British had assembled their assault force on the beaches below. Nearly 2,400 professional soldiers, supported by artillery and naval gunfire, prepared to teach the colonial upstarts a lesson about challenging the Crown's authority. What none of them could foresee was that this single day would fundamentally alter the nature of the conflict, transforming a colonial rebellion into a war that would reshape the world. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the British troops as they formed their ranks on the Charlestown Peninsula. Major General William Howe, resplendent in his scarlet uniform, despite the sweltering heat, reviewed his battle plan one final time. The strategy appeared deceptively simple: advance in traditional European formation up the hill, overwhelm the colonial defenses through superior discipline and firepower, and crush this rebellion before it could spread beyond Massachusetts. Yet as Howe studied the terrain, a nagging doubt crept into his military mind. The colonial position was stronger than initial reports had suggested. The earthworks on Breed's Hill, though hastily constructed, showed signs of tactical intelligence that surprised the British command. Stone walls and wooden fences had been incorporated into the defensive line, creating interlocking fields of fire that would channel any assault into carefully prepared killing zones. Intelligence reports suggested that many of the colonial officers had served in the French and Indian War, bringing hard-won experience to their desperate cause.
Nice.
Among the British ranks, Lieutenant Colonel James Abercrombie adjusted his gorget and checked his pocket watch. The young officer, nephew to a general, had arrived in Boston, expecting to participate in police actions against unruly merchants and farmers. Instead, he found himself preparing for what increasingly appeared to be a conventional military engagement. The colonial forces had demonstrated an organizational capability that transformed them from a mob into an army, and this realization sent ripples of concern through the British officer corps. According to contemporary accounts documented by the Massachusetts Historical Society, the British had initially underestimated both the numbers and the determination of the colonial forces. Colonel Prescott had managed to assemble nearly 1,500 men on the heights, including contingents from Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New Hampshire. These were not the ragged militia that British propaganda had portrayed, but organized companies led by experienced officers who understood the tactical advantages of defensive warfare. The colonial preparations continued throughout the early afternoon, with remarkable efficiency given their amateur status. Dr. Joseph Warren, the prominent Boston physician and political leader, arrived to serve as a volunteer private in the ranks, refusing the command position offered to him. His presence symbolized the gravity of the moment and the commitment of the colonial leadership to their cause. Warren's decision to fight as a common soldier rather than observe from safety would prove prophetic of the sacrifices this war would demand. Captain John Chester of the Connecticut militia watched the British preparations with growing anxiety. His men, many of whom had never faced professional soldiers in battle, displayed a mixture of determination and fear that reflected the broader colonial mood. They had committed themselves to a course of action that could only end in victory or the gallows, and this stark reality focused their attention wonderfully. Chester noted in his diary that the men spoke little but worked continuously, understanding that their lives depended on the strength of their fortifications. The British artillery began its bombardment in the early afternoon with cannon fire from both ships and shore batteries. The thunderous roar echoed across Boston Harbor, rattling windows and stopping conversations throughout the city. The colonial forces endured this preliminary bombardment with remarkable steadiness. Having been instructed to conserve their ammunition for the main assault, the psychological effect of the artillery was significant. But the physical damage to the well-constructed earthworks remained minimal. As the British final preparations neared completion, both sides understood that they stood at a historical crossroads. The colonial forces had committed themselves to open rebellion against the Crown, while the British faced the prospect of using military force against their own subjects on a scale not seen since the English Civil War. The outcome of the next few hours would determine whether this remained a local uprising or escalated into a full-scale war for independence. The British advance began at precisely 3 o'clock in the afternoon. With the measured cadence of professional soldiers who had conquered half the known world, General Howe led from the front, his sword gleaming in the afternoon sun, as 2 columns of scarlet-clad infantry began their deliberate march up the slope toward the colonial earthworks. The sight was both magnificent and terrifying. Row upon row of disciplined soldiers moving in perfect formation, their bayonets catching the light like a forest of steel. The colonial defenders watched in tense silence as the British approached, many of them seeing professional European soldiers in battle array for the first time. Colonel Prescott moved among his men, offering quiet words of encouragement and reminding them of their orders. Wait until the enemy came within effective range, and make every shot count. The colonial ammunition supply was limited, and there would be no opportunity for wasteful volleys at long range. The British confidence was evident in their unhurried advance. These soldiers had fought in Europe and the Caribbean, facing French regulars and Spanish infantry in formal battles where courage and discipline determined the outcome. The colonial militia, however determined, lacked the training and equipment of professional soldiers. The British officers expected the rebels to break and run at the first sight of leveled bayonets, ending this unfortunate rebellion with a single decisive charge. As the British columns approached within 100 yards of the colonial line, the defenders could see individual faces beneath the tall mitre caps and bearskin hats. Young soldiers, many barely out of their teens, advanced with the mechanical precision drilled into them on parade grounds across the empire. Behind them came the grenadiers, the elite troops selected for their size and courage. Their presence intended to intimidate any enemy foolish enough to stand against the Crown's authority. The first colonial volley erupted when the British reached 50 yards from the earthworks, a thunderous crash that momentarily obscured the battlefield in white smoke. When the smoke cleared, the carefully ordered British ranks had been shattered. Men lay scattered across the slope, some crying out for help, others ominously silent. The survivors staggered backward, their formation broken, their confidence shaken by the devastating accuracy of the colonial fire. General Howe found himself virtually alone on the slope, his staff officers and orderlies cut down around him. The colonial marksmen had deliberately targeted officers, disrupting the British command structure and creating confusion in the ranks. This was not the gentlemanly warfare of European battlefields where opposing armies acknowledged each other's honor even in defeat. This was something new and frightening. People's war, where every man was a potential enemy and every shot was aimed to kill. The British withdrawal down the slope was neither orderly nor dignified. Professional soldiers who had never known defeat found themselves scrambling for cover, dragging wounded comrades and abandoning equipment in their haste to escape the murderous fire from the colonial earthworks. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical casualties. These were the same troops who had defeated the French at Quebec and the Spanish at Havana, yet they had been repulsed by colonial farmers and shopkeepers. Colonel Prescott used the respite to redistribute ammunition and strengthen his defenses. Men had performed magnificently, but he knew the British would return with modified tactics and renewed determination. The first assault had been a colonial victory, but the war was far from over. The British Empire did not accept defeat easily, and the next attack would likely be more carefully planned and more vigorously executed. As the British regrouped at the bottom of the hill, treating their wounded and reforming their ranks, both sides understood that something fundamental had changed. The colonial forces had proved they could stand against professional soldiers and inflict significant casualties through superior marksmanship and defensive positioning. The British, meanwhile, had learned that this rebellion would not be easily suppressed through traditional military methods. The British second assault commenced with grim determination, their ranks reformed and their tactics modified by the harsh lessons of the first repulse. General Howe, his uniform now stained with powder smoke and the blood of fallen aides, personally led the reorganized attack. The British had abandoned their traditional close-order formations in favor of a more dispersed advance, attempting to reduce the effectiveness of colonial concentrated fire, while maintaining sufficient cohesion for the final bayonet charge. The colonial defenders, now confident in their abilities but increasingly concerned about their dwindling ammunition supply, watched the renewed British advance with steely resolve. Colonel Prescott had passed word along the line: every shot must count, and no man should fire until he could see the whites of the enemy's eyes. This famous command, though perhaps apocryphal, captured the desperate efficiency required of the colonial forces in their unequal contest against the Empire's military might. The second British advance proved more cautious than the first, with soldiers taking advantage of every stone wall and depression in the ground to provide cover during their uphill assault. The colonial marksmen found fewer clear targets, but their disciplined fire continued to exact a terrible toll on the attacking force. British officers, recognizing the threat posed by the accurate colonial shooting, had removed or covered the distinctive marks of their rank. But experienced colonial hunters could still identify them by their bearing and position in the formation. Lieutenant Colonel James Abercrombie fell during this second assault, struck down by a colonial sharpshooter who had waited patiently for the perfect shot. The young officer's death symbolized the broader British discovery that this colonial rebellion differed fundamentally from the European wars in which they had earned their reputations. Here, every rock and tree might conceal an enemy, and the traditional rules of warfare seemed to have been abandoned in favor of a more ruthless and practical approach to killing. The British artillery, repositioned during the lull between assaults, began to find the range of the colonial earthworks. Solid shot and grape shot tore through the defensive positions, killing and wounding defenders who had survived the individual marksmanship of the first attack. The colonial forces, lacking artillery of their own, could only endure this bombardment while conserving their small arms ammunition for the crucial moment, when British infantry would again attempt to storm their position. As documented in the pension records of the Continental Congress, many colonial soldiers performed acts of extraordinary courage during these desperate hours. Private Peter Salem, an African-American soldier from Massachusetts, would later be credited with killing Major John Pitcairn of the Royal Marines during the climactic moments of the battle. Salem's action represented the broader participation of marginalized colonial populations in the struggle for independence. It's a social revolution that paralleled the political rebellion against British authority. The second British assault pressed closer to the colonial earthworks than the first, with some soldiers reaching within 20 yards of the defensive line before being cut down by devastating close-range fire. The colonial defenders could see the faces of their enemies clearly now. Young men not unlike themselves who had been caught up in the machinery of imperial conflict, yet there was no room for sentiment in this deadly business. Survival depended on loading and firing with mechanical precision, treating each British soldier as a target rather than a human being. Dr. Joseph Warren, the Boston physician who had insisted on fighting as a common soldier, fell during the second assault. His death sent shockwaves through the colonial ranks, as Warren had been one of the most prominent political leaders in Massachusetts. His decision to risk his life alongside ordinary soldiers had inspired the colonial cause, and his death would later be remembered as one of the most significant casualties of the early war. The second British assault ultimately failed like the first, with the attackers withdrawing down the slope under the continued fire of the colonial defenders. However, the British had learned valuable lessons about colonial tactics and resolve. These rebels could not be dismissed as an armed mob. They fought with the discipline and determination of professional soldiers, and their leaders were willing to die for their cause. The British command now understood that suppressing this rebellion would require a fundamental reconsideration of their military strategy. The British third and final assault began as the afternoon sun started its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the blood-soaked slope of Breed's Hill. General Howe, now understanding that traditional European tactics would not suffice against the colonial defenders, modified his approach once again. This time, the British would focus their main effort against the colonial left flank, where the earthworks appeared weakest, and the defensive lines seemed most vulnerable to concentrated assault. The colonial ammunition situation had become critical. Colonel Prescott moved among his men, collecting cartridges from the wounded and dead, redistributing the precious gunpowder that would determine whether they could maintain their defensive fire. Many soldiers were down to their last few rounds. Some companies had begun to discuss the unthinkable, abandoning their positions before the British could overrun them. Psychological pressure was immense, as the defenders knew that capture meant certain execution for treason. The British had also learned to coordinate their naval gunfire more effectively with their ground assault. Ships in Boston Harbor began a systematic bombardment of the colonial positions, while shore-based artillery concentrated on suppressing the most dangerous sections of the defensive line. The combined effect was devastating, with colonial soldiers forced to keep their heads down, while British infantry advanced under cover of this protective fire. Major General Henry Clinton, who had arrived as reinforcement during the second assault, now took command of the critical left flank attack. Clinton was a more experienced and flexible commander than Howe, and he recognized that the colonial position could only be taken through careful tactical coordination rather than brute force. His plan involved simultaneous attacks from multiple directions designed to overwhelm the colonial defenders and prevent them from concentrating their fire on any single threat. The colonial forces had been reinforced during the lull between the second and third assaults, with additional militia companies arriving from the surrounding countryside. However, these reinforcements were largely untrained and poorly equipped, lacking the battle experience that had made the original defenders so effective. Some of these new arrivals fled at the first sight of British bayonets, creating gaps in the defensive line that experienced colonial officers struggled to fill. The third British assault pressed forward with renewed determination. The soldiers, now understanding that their professional reputation and perhaps their lives depended on carrying the colonial position, the attackers had learned to use the terrain more effectively, approaching the earthworks from multiple directions and making it difficult for the defenders to maintain their concentrated fire. British officers, though still suffering heavy casualties, managed to maintain better control over their men during this final advance. As recorded in the Massachusetts Soldiers and Sailors of the Revolutionary War, the colonial defense began to crumble when their ammunition finally ran out. Soldiers who had maintained disciplined fire throughout the day now found themselves facing British bayonets with empty muskets. Some attempted to use their weapons as clubs, while others threw rocks and pieces of broken equipment at the advancing enemy. The sight was both heroic and futile as untrained militia attempted to engage professional soldiers in hand-to-hand combat. The British finally breached the colonial earthworks as the sun began to set, their bayonets gleaming in the fading light as they poured over the defensive walls. Teehee hand-to-hand fighting was brutal and desperate, with colonial soldiers using knives, hatchets, and even their bare hands to resist the British assault. Many defenders fought until they were literally cut down, preferring death to capture and the inevitable fate of traitors. Colonel Prescott, recognizing that the position was no longer tenable, ordered a fighting withdrawal. The colonial forces began to retreat across the narrow neck of the Charlestown Peninsula. Harassed by British infantry and subjected to artillery fire from both land and sea, the retreat was costly, with many colonial soldiers falling during the dangerous crossing. But it preserved the core of the force for future operations. The British victory was complete, but Pyrrhic. They had captured the colonial position and driven the rebels from the field, but the cost had been enormous. Nearly half of the attacking force had been killed or wounded, a casualty rate that would have been considered catastrophic in any European war. Colonial forces, though defeated, had demonstrated their ability to inflict devastating losses on professional soldiers and had gained invaluable experience in conventional warfare. As darkness fell over the Charlestown Peninsula, the true cost of the Battle of Bunker Hill became horrifyingly apparent. The British had achieved their tactical objective of clearing the colonial forces from the heights. But the strategic implications of their victory were far more complex than anyone had anticipated. General Howe stood among the captured earthworks, surveying the carnage that stretched down the slope like a crimson carpet in the moonlight, and began to understand that this rebellion would not be easily suppressed. The British casualties were staggering by the standards of 18th-century warfare. Over 1,000 officers and men had been killed or wounded, including 92 officers, a devastating blow to the British command structure in North America. The Grenadier and Light Infantry companies, the elite units of the British Army, had suffered particularly heavy losses. Some companies had lost more than half their strength, and several had been virtually annihilated by the accurate fire of the colonial marksmen. Among the British dead lay Major John Pitcairn of the Royal Marines, the same officer who had commanded British forces at Lexington and Concord 2 months earlier. Pitcairn's death symbolized the escalating nature of the conflict. As officers who had participated in the initial skirmishes of the rebellion now fell in conventional battle, the loss of experienced leaders like Pitcairn would have long-term consequences for British military effectiveness in North America. The colonial losses, while significant, were proportionally much lighter than those suffered by the British. Fewer than 500 colonial soldiers had been killed or wounded, though among the dead was Dr. Joseph Warren, whose loss was deeply felt throughout the rebellious colonies. Warren's death would be commemorated in countless speeches and pamphlets, transforming him into one of the first martyrs of the American independence movement. The psychological impact of the battle extended far beyond the immediate casualties. British soldiers who had considered themselves the finest infantry in the world had been repeatedly repulsed by colonial militia, and this knowledge would affect their morale and confidence in future engagements. The myth of British invincibility, carefully cultivated through decades of imperial conquest, had been shattered on the slopes of Breed's Hill. News of the battle spread rapidly throughout the 13 colonies, carried by writers who understood the significance of what had occurred. The colonial forces had proven they could stand against professional soldiers and inflict heavy casualties through superior marksmanship and defensive tactics. This knowledge would inspire thousands of additional volunteers to join the Continental Army and would convince many neutral colonists that independence was achievable. The British response to their Pyrrhic victory would fundamentally alter their strategy for suppressing the rebellion. General Gage, who had advocated for a policy of limited military action combined with political conciliation, was recalled to London in disgrace. His replacement, General Howe, understood that the colonial rebellion could not be crushed through conventional military operations alone. The British would need to develop new tactics, recruit larger armies, and prepare for a prolonged conflict. King George III, upon receiving reports of the battle, reportedly declared that the blows struck at Bunker Hill were too heavy to be endured by any European army. The King's observation reflected the broader British realization that this colonial rebellion differed fundamentally from previous imperial conflicts. The colonists were not fighting for limited political objectives, but for their survival as a free people, and this desperation made them far more dangerous than conventional enemies. The Battle of Bunker Hill also had significant international implications. European powers who had been watching the developing conflict with interest now began to take the colonial rebellion seriously. The French, still smarting from their defeat in the 7 Years' War, saw an opportunity to weaken British power by supporting the American rebels. The Spanish and Dutch, with their own colonial empires to consider, began to reassess their relationships with Britain in light of the colonial military effectiveness. The tactical lessons learned at Bunker Hill would influence military thinking for generations. The effectiveness of defensive positions, the importance of accurate marksmanship, and the vulnerability of traditional European formations to irregular tactics would all be studied and incorporated into military doctrine. The battle marked the beginning of a new era in warfare, where technological advantages and professional training could be offset by tactical innovation and superior motivation. The long-term consequences of the Battle of Bunker Hill extended far beyond the immediate tactical results, reshaping British strategy for the American Revolution and influencing the broader course of the conflict. In the weeks following the battle, British military planners in London began to grasp the magnitude of the challenge they faced in North America. The colonial rebellion could no longer be dismissed as a local uprising that could be suppressed through limited military action and political conciliation. Lord North's government, previously confident that a show of force would bring the rebellious colonies to heel, now faced the prospect of a protracted war against an enemy that had demonstrated both military competence and unwavering determination. The British Army, stretched thin across a global empire, would need to be significantly reinforced if it hoped to suppress the American rebellion. This realization led to a fundamental shift in British strategic thinking, from police action to full-scale military conquest. The battle also marked the beginning of a new phase in colonial military organization. The Continental Congress, meeting in Philadelphia, recognized that the success at Bunker Hill had been achieved through the courage and determination of individual soldiers rather than through superior military organization. The appointment of George Washington as commander-in-chief represented an attempt to create a truly professional army that could stand against British regulars in conventional battle while maintaining the fighting spirit that had made the colonial militia so effective. British recruiting efforts intensified dramatically in the months following Bunker Hill, with the government authorizing the formation of new regiments and the hiring of foreign mercenaries to supplement British forces. The decision to employ Hessian soldiers reflected the British understanding that the colonial rebellion would require a massive military commitment that Britain could not meet through its own resources alone. This internationalization of the conflict would have profound implications for its ultimate outcome. The tactical innovations demonstrated at Bunker Hill began to influence military thinking throughout Europe. The effectiveness of defensive positions, combined with accurate marksmanship, challenged traditional notions of battlefield supremacy based on disciplined formations and bayonet charges. Military theorists began to study the American experience, incorporating lessons learned from the colonial rebellion into their own tactical doctrines. The battle's impact on colonial morale cannot be overstated. The knowledge that American soldiers could stand against British regulars and inflict devastating casualties spread throughout the 13 colonies, inspiring thousands of additional volunteers to join the Continental Army. The propaganda value of the victory was immense, with colonial newspapers and pamphlets celebrating the courage of the defenders and the heavy losses inflicted on the British forces. International observers began to take the American rebellion seriously following the Battle of Bunker Hill. European powers that had previously viewed the colonial uprising as a minor disturbance now recognized it as a significant challenge, too. British imperial power. The French in particular began to consider the possibility of supporting the American rebels as a means of weakening their traditional enemy and recovering some of the territories lost during the 7 Years' War. The British decision to abandon Boston in March of 1776 can be traced directly to the lessons learned at Bunker Hill. General Howe, recognizing that his forces were insufficient to maintain control of a hostile city while simultaneously conducting offensive operations, chose to evacuate his army to New York, where he could operate with greater strategic flexibility. This withdrawal represented a significant psychological victory for the colonial forces and demonstrated the long-term strategic consequences of the battle. The Battle of Bunker Hill established patterns that would characterize the American Revolution for the next 8 years. The British would continue to win most conventional battles, but their victories would come at such heavy costs that they could not sustain their military position indefinitely. The colonial forces, meanwhile, would develop the strategic patience necessary for a war of attrition, understanding that they did not need to defeat the British Army, but merely needed to make the cost of suppressing the rebellion prohibitive. The legacy of Bunker Hill extends far beyond the American Revolution itself. The battle demonstrated that citizen soldiers, properly motivated and led, could successfully resist professional armies, providing inspiration for democratic movements around the world. The tactical lessons learned on Breed's Hill would influence military thinking for generations, while the strategic implications of the battle helped shape the modern concept of guerrilla warfare and popular resistance to foreign occupation. In the end, the Battle of Bunker Hill represented a turning point not just in the American Revolution, but in the broader history of warfare and political resistance. The colonial victory, though technically a defeat, proved that the age of unquestioned imperial dominance was ending, and that the future belonged to those who could adapt their military strategies to new political and social realities.